Beneath the mist of the Scottish Highlands, where power was measured in acres and bloodlines, one woman ruled with both iron and tenderness. Anna Gordon, the Countess of Sutherland, commanded vast lands and political might, yet her heart burned with a forbidden fire history tried to silence. In the candlelit corridors of Victorian power, she wrote letters not of diplomacy, but of love, to another woman. Was it rebellion or revolution disguised as romance? This is the untold story of a baroness who defied empire, patriarchy, and the boundaries of love itself. If history's whispers move you, and the hidden loves of the past deserve to be heard, help us keep their voices alive. Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below to join Crown Secrets, where every forgotten queer figure, every untold royal truth, and every silenced heart finds its place in the light again. The 19th century Scottish Highlands were a land of haunting beauty and bitter upheaval. Mist rolled over empty glens where once families had lived for generations, evicted in what history calls the Highland clearances. Amid this storm of displacement and reform, one name rose above the rest: Anna Gordon, Countess of Sutherland. She was a woman of immense power, a land baroness in an age when women were expected to remain silent. Her signature decided the fate of thousands, yet behind her commanding presence lay a secret life history chose to forget. In the quiet hours of the night, Anna's quill danced across paper, not drafting political decrees, but writing to the woman she loved. Her letters, now uncovered from dusty archives, reveal a passion that both defied and defined her. It was love that fueled her reform, intimacy that ignited her defiance. While Britain's empire expanded abroad, Anna fought her own internal empire, the patriarchal chains that sought to bind her heart and power alike. As the Highland winds howled with the voices of the displaced, Anna Gordon stood at the crossroads of privilege and compassion, love and duty. Her story challenges what it meant to wield power as a woman and as a queer soul in a world built to silence both. In the northern reaches of Scotland, where wind met stone and mist cloaked the hills like a shroud, a child was born into a house that ruled more than land. The Gordons of Sutherland were not merely nobles, they were architects of the Highlands' destiny. Anna Gordon came into the world in 1806, beneath the echo of church bells and the distant hum of the sea. Her birth was celebrated in the grand hall of Dunrobin Castle, where portraits of stern ancestors gazed down from the walls, men who had fought wars, shaped borders, and decided fates with the stroke of a quill. From her earliest years, Anna was drawn not to the embroidery of court ladies or the idle gossip of the drawing room, but to the rhythms of the land itself. She roamed the moors with bare hands and curious eyes, watching the crofters tend their sheep, listening to the Gaelic songs that carried through the heather. Her tutors found her restless, too inquisitive for a girl, too bold in her questions about God, duty, and why men alone were said to rule. Her mother, Lady Isabel Gordon, feared that the world would break a girl with such a spirit. "You must learn to bend," she warned one winter night as they watched snow gather against the castle windows. But her father, an aging earl who saw in her a rare fire, only smiled. "Better she learns to burn," he said. As the 19th century unfolded, Scotland was caught in a quiet storm. Industrial progress crept northward, promising wealth to a few and ruin to many. The Highland clearances had begun, the forced eviction of tenant farmers to make room for vast sheep pastures. The Gordons, like many great houses, found themselves at the center of a moral and political reckoning. When Anna's father died suddenly in 1825, the young woman inherited more than land. She inherited the weight of centuries. At just 19, she became one of the wealthiest and most scrutinized women in Britain. Parliament whispered her name. The press called her the Northern Duchess, though she held no such title. Her fortune stretched across counties, her word carried to London salons. Yet with that power came a curse. Every decision she made would be judged through the lens of her sex. In letters to a trusted friend, Anna wrote, "Power sits uneasily on a woman's shoulders, for men expect her to carry it like silk, not iron." Those words would one day be quoted in reform circles, but at the time they were little more than a confession to the one person who seemed to truly understand her, Eleanor Fitzgerald, a writer and reformist from Edinburgh who would become the great secret of Anna's life. Their paths crossed in 1828 at a charity gathering for displaced Highland families. Eleanor spoke with conviction, her voice steady as she condemned the greed of landowners who treated their tenants as pawns. Anna, seated among nobles who dismissed the speech as hysterical, felt her heart stir, not with indignation, but admiration. After the event, she approached Eleanor, drawn to her like a flame to breath. What began as polite correspondence soon blossomed into something neither dared name. Through letters written in flowing ink and trembling restraint, their affection deepened. Anna signed her notes, "Yours in silence and storm." Eleanor replied, "In your shadow I find the courage to stand." But outside the safety of parchment, the world demanded masks. In public, Anna was the formidable countess, a figure of authority draped in velvet and expectation. In private, she became something raw, questioning, alive. She wrote of love not as sin, but as salvation. And yet, even as passion grew, the highlands around her darkened. The clearances intensified. Entire villages were uprooted. Smoke rose from cottages that had stood for generations. Anna walked her lands and saw the sorrow in her tenants' eyes, the same people her family's fortune depended upon. She felt the weight of inheritance press against her chest like a chain. In her private diary, she wrote, "How can I command the soil when it bleeds beneath my feet?" It was Eleanor who urged her to act, to use her influence not for preservation, but reform. And so began Anna's transformation from land baroness to political force. She petitioned Parliament for fair tenancy laws, spoke in coded letters to reformists in Edinburgh, and quietly funded relocation efforts for displaced families. Each move was met with resistance from male peers, who accused her of meddling in matters beyond a lady's station. But Anna no longer bowed to station. By the 1830s, she had become a paradox in silk, a noble woman who defied nobles, a baroness whose compassion made enemies. Newspapers alternately painted her as a saint or a seductress, the Angel of Sutherland or the Highland Jezebel. To them, a woman acting on conscience was scandal enough. A woman rumored to love another woman was unspeakable. Still, the Countess moved through the storm with measured grace. Her influence reached the highest levels of politics. Ministers who once dismissed her as naive now sought her counsel. And though whispers followed her wherever she went, she met them with a calm that unsettled her critics. In a letter to Eleanor dated 1834, she wrote, "They call me unnatural, yet what is more unnatural than a world that fears love and worships greed?" That year marked the turning point. The Highland clearances entered their most violent phase. In some areas, the evictions turned into riots. In others, despair drove families to starvation. Anna found herself torn between duty to her estate and the call of her conscience. In London, advisors demanded she protect her assets. In her heart, she heard the voices of the displaced crying through the wind. She chose rebellion, quiet, deliberate rebellion. She began to sell portions of her estate to fund tenant resettlement programs and public works. She secretly commissioned surveys that documented the cruelty of the clearances,
forwarding them to sympathetic members of Parliament. Her defiance cost her alliances, reputation, and nearly her fortune. But it also won her a new name, whispered among reformers: the People's Countess. Eleanor stood beside her through it all, not as lover in public, but as secretary and advisor. Together, they wove change from the edges of society's tolerance. What began as forbidden affection had become a partnership that reshaped the Highlands. And yet beneath their triumphs, the shadow of exposure loomed ever near.
By the late 1830s, Anna Gordon had become both admired and feared. In the polished halls of London's political elite, her name carried a curious power, spoken in admiration by reformists and in quiet disdain by traditionalists. The newspapers alternated between portraits of her as a visionary landowner and venomous caricatures of a woman gone unnaturally bold. She had made enemies. The Duke of Roxburgh called her the woman who thinks herself a man. A bishop in Edinburgh condemned her in a sermon, claiming that her unfeminine independence threatened the moral fabric of the Highlands. But Anna, steady and deliberate, never retaliated with words. She retaliated with actions. Her estates became testing grounds for social reform. She built schools for tenant children, established medical aid for evicted families, and created smallholder projects that allowed displaced crofters to rebuild their livelihoods. For the first time, the idea of a woman as a reformer, not merely a philanthropist, entered public conversation. She had given the poor not pity, but dignity. Yet behind the facade of progress, her private life began to tremble under the weight of scrutiny. Whispers followed her like the northern wind, rumors of letters, of intimacy between the Countess and her lady secretary. Some said they shared a suite when traveling. Others claimed a servant had seen them walking hand in hand at dusk along the shore near Dunrobin. In an era when reputation could make or unmake power, scandal was a weapon. In 1841, that weapon was turned upon her. A set of personal letters, copies of her correspondence with Eleanor Fitzgerald, surfaced mysteriously in the hands of a London journalist. The words, though coded and restrained, left little to the imagination. One line read, "Your voice lingers in my thoughts like the sea against stone." Another, "When I stand before Parliament, it is your courage I borrow." The story broke in the Morning Gazette under the headline, "A Lady's Affection, Unnatural Intimacy in the Highlands." The shockwaves were immediate. Her peers recoiled, her allies fell silent. Invitations to London salons vanished. Even Parliament, once amused by her ambition, now looked upon her with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. For the first time, Anna withdrew from public life. The great halls of Dunrobin fell quiet. The once busy courtyards, filled with petitioners and laborers, seemed to hold their breath. She walked the corridors like a ghost of her former self. Eleanor, ever steadfast, refused to leave her side. In one surviving letter, written during that exile, Eleanor penned, "Let them name us what they wish. They cannot unmake what love has already carved into the stone of this earth." Those months of isolation transformed Anna. Her sorrow turned to resolve. She had spent her life balancing between expectation and conviction. Now she saw that balance as a form of submission. By 1843, she returned to public life not as the compliant noblewoman society expected, but as a force of reckoning. She sold one of her English estates and donated the profits to the formation of the Highland Relief League, a radical organization advocating for tenant rights, education, and women's participation in reform politics. It was the first major land-based philanthropic effort in Scotland led by a woman.
and it shook the British elite to its core. Even Queen Victoria, who had recently ascended the throne, took cautious note of the Countess of Sutherland. In private correspondence, the Queen referred to her as that difficult lady of the North. Anna took the title as a compliment. Her defiance began to inspire others. Among the growing feminist movement in Edinburgh and London, she became a quiet symbol of courage. Reformist writers, particularly women, quoted her speeches in journals. Pamphlets circulated under titles like The People's Countess and Her Land and Her Love. What made her remarkable was not merely her rebellion, it was her endurance. Each attack she faced, she countered with intellect. When critics accused her of moral corruption, she published essays on ethics and governance under a pseudonym, arguing that virtue lies not in the mask one wears, but in the good one dares. When they mocked her for overstepping her role, she cited scripture and law, twisting both to reveal the hypocrisy of her accusers.
Still, the strain of secrecy gnawed at her. She and Eleanor lived under constant caution, letters hidden in book spines, meetings arranged under the guise of charitable correspondence. And yet, within that secrecy, their bond grew unbreakable. In 1848, during the European revolutions that rippled across the continent, Anna saw in the cries for freedom a reflection of her own struggle. She wrote in her journal, "The world is turning. The old thrones tremble. If I must fall, let it be for something that shifts the ground beneath them." She hosted gatherings at Dunrobin, inviting thinkers, poets, and early feminists. Among them was Mary Somerville, the renowned Scottish scientist and advocate for women's education. Somerville later wrote, "The Countess spoke as one born before her time, her words stitched with fire and grace." But as Anna's influence rose once more, tragedy returned to her doorstep. In 1851, Eleanor fell ill with tuberculosis. Doctors recommended travel to the warmer climate of southern France. Anna arranged it herself, selling part of her London holdings to fund the journey. The two women spent that winter in Nice, away from gossip, surrounded by olive groves and the salt of the Mediterranean air. For a brief season, they knew peace. Eleanor's condition, however, worsened. One night, as rain fell softly against the villa windows, she asked Anna to promise something. "Do not let them bury our story in silence." Anna wept and answered, "Then I shall live loudly enough for us both." Eleanor died in her sleep days later. Anna buried her in a small cemetery overlooking the sea, under a simple headstone inscribed with a single word, "Beloved." When she returned to Scotland the following spring, the woman who stepped onto the damp Highland soil was no longer the same. The scandal that had once broken her now seemed trivial. The judgment of peers meant nothing. She had lost the person who understood her most, and in that loss she discovered absolute freedom. She turned her grief into motion. From 1852 onward, the Countess became one of the most active reformers in Britain. She founded schools for orphaned girls, supported suffrage petitions in Edinburgh, and worked tirelessly to reform estate law, ensuring that widows and women landowners could hold property without male guardianship. She became a voice not only for queer women who lived in shadows, but for all women who lived under control. In speeches delivered in Glasgow and Inverness, she declared that the empire's true weakness lies not in its colonies, but in its chains upon its daughters. Such words were dangerous. Newspapers condemned her anew. Priests preached against her, but this time she welcomed the outrage. To those who accused her of moral decay, she replied with the calm of someone who had already faced the abyss. "History will not ask whom I loved," she once said to a journalist, "only what I dared." As the 1850s gave way to the 1860s, her reputation transformed again, from scandalous to legendary. Younger reformers, both men and women, visited her Highland estate seeking counsel. The crofters still called her Lady of the People. To them, she was not a fallen noblewoman, but a savior who had used her privilege to bring justice where there had been none. Her hair silvered, her step slowed, but her fire did not fade. Each evening she would walk the cliffs above the sea where she and Eleanor had once stood.
the waves crashing below like applause for a life that refused silence. She often whispered to the wind, "You were right, my love. They cannot bury our story."
In the autumn of her life, Anna Gordon moved with the quiet assurance of one who had made peace with her ghosts. Dunrobin Castle stood as it always had, its towers spearing the Highland sky, its stones cold and immortal, but the woman within had changed it forever. What was once a fortress of privilege had become a sanctuary for progress. Within its walls, scholars debated law and literature, artists found patrons, and the poor found a rare kind of nobility, compassion. By the 1870s, her reputation had ripened into myth. To some, she was a saint of reform. To others, still, a scandal in silk. But to those who knew her story, the crofters, the widows, the women who wrote her letters of gratitude, she was simply Anna, the woman who had dared. Her work in land reform gained new life as Parliament began to reconsider tenancy rights in the wake of public outcry. Many of her proposals, once mocked as female fancy, were now cited in official debates. The Highland Relief League, which she had founded decades earlier, became a cornerstone for the eventual Crofters Holdings Act of 1886. Though she would not live to see it, the legislation bore her fingerprints. Each morning, she sat by the window of her library overlooking the sea, dictating letters to young activists and writers who sought her guidance. Her handwriting had grown shaky, but her words still carried precision and warmth. "Do not let them teach you that obedience is virtue," she wrote to a young reformer in Edinburgh. "There is a holiness in defiance when it serves the voiceless." Even as her body weakened, her mind roamed. She followed international news, the rise of suffrage movements in America, the stirrings of labor rights across Europe. In these upheavals, she saw reflections of her own fight, different in shape, but bound by the same struggle: the right to live truthfully in the face of power. It was during this twilight period that an unexpected visitor arrived. In 1883, Isabella Gordon, a distant cousin and journalist, traveled from London to interview the aging Countess for a piece on women in politics. Isabella had grown up hearing conflicting tales, some describing Anna as a fallen noblewoman, others as a visionary hero. What she found instead was a frail but luminous figure, her eyes still carrying the piercing clarity of a younger fire. The two spoke for hours. Anna recounted her battles with Parliament, her early reforms, and the unending resistance she faced from the establishment. But when Isabella gently asked about Eleanor Fitzgerald, Anna fell silent. For a moment, only the wind filled the room, brushing the curtains like the turning of a page. Then, softly, she said, "History has no mercy for women who love too deeply. But love needs no historian. It survives in the living." Those words would later appear, nearly verbatim, in Isabella's published article titled "The Northern Flame, A Lady's Rebellion." The piece reintroduced Anna Gordon to the Victorian public, not as a scandal, but as a pioneer. Still, not all welcomed the rediscovery. The church bristled, conservative papers called the piece dangerous romanticism. But the younger generation, especially women and intellectuals, saw in Anna's story something rare, a reflection of courage that transcended the boundaries of respectability. As the end drew near, Anna withdrew from society once more. She spent her final years surrounded by books, correspondence, and the laughter of the few loyal servants who had stood by her since youth. On clear evenings, she walked the same cliffs where she and Eleanor had once watched the tide rise. The wind carried the scent of salt and heather, the waves murmured like memory. In her last recorded letter, dated December 1888, she wrote, "If I am remembered, let it not be as noble or scandalous, but as one who tried to see the human heart beneath the crowns and crests. Love, after all, is the only empire worth ruling." She passed away the following spring, in 1889, at the age of 83.
Her funeral was small, as she had requested. No grand procession, no gilded epitaphs. The service was attended by tenants, reformers, and distant family. When the minister read the final prayer, a young woman stepped forward and laid a single white rose on the coffin. No one knew her name. Some whispered she was the daughter of Eleanor Fitzgerald's cousin. Others believed she was simply a student inspired by the Countess's story. Anna was buried on the grounds of Dunrobin, facing east toward the sea. A simple inscription marked her grave. She dared. For decades after her death, her name faded into the folds of history. The estates she once ruled changed hands. The records of her reforms were absorbed into broader movements. Her letters, especially those to Eleanor, were quietly sealed away by family descendants, hidden in a locked chest in Dunrobin archives. It would take nearly a century for her voice to return.
In the late 20th century, historians rediscovering forgotten women of the Victorian age stumbled upon fragments of Anna's correspondence. The letters, long presumed lost, revealed a vivid portrait of intellect, tenderness, and rebellion. They spoke not only of love, but of a philosophy that connected intimacy with justice. To love freely, one line read, is the first act of political defiance. Modern scholars recognized what Victorian society could not. Anna Gordon had been more than a reformer. She had been an early architect of intersectional thought, understanding instinctively that gender, class, and love were threads of the same binding fabric. By the dawn of the 21st century, her legacy had begun to resurface in academic papers, feminist anthologies, and even art exhibitions. In Edinburgh, a small plaque was placed in her honor. Anna Gordon, Countess of Sutherland, 1806 to 1889, landowner, reformer, visionary. But those who read beyond the surface saw more than the dates and titles. They saw the story of a woman who lived centuries ahead of her time, who loved without permission, ruled with empathy, and turned heartbreak into history. In queer circles across Scotland, her name became a symbol of reclamation. Writers and activists invoked her memory as proof that queerness had always been part of the nation's tapestry, woven into its castles and its crofts, its poetry and its politics. Every October, during LGBT History Month in the UK, a small gathering is held near the ruins of her estate. People come with candles, some bringing flowers, others reciting her letters aloud. The wind still carries the same salt and chill, but in those voices, her defiance breathes again. For them, she is not a ghost of scandal, but a beacon of endurance, a reminder that power, when guided by compassion, can outlast the centuries that try to silence it. Today, Anna Gordon stands among the many unsung figures whose stories reshape the way we understand history. She represents the forgotten truth that the past was never as straight, as quiet, or as obedient as it was written to be. Her life, one of privilege and persecution, of power and passion, invites us to ask how many other voices like hers still lie buried beneath the weight of respectability. In every age, there are those who dare to love beyond their station, to rule beyond permission, to speak when silence is safer. Anna Gordon was one of them. And though her body rests in the cold earth of Sutherland, her fire still burns in the hearts of those who refuse to hide. As the story closes, imagine her standing once more upon those wind-swept cliffs, her gown rippling like the Highland mist. The sea roars below, endless and untamed. She looks toward the horizon, not as a noble, not as a scandal, but as a woman who lived fully, fiercely, and freely. In her defiance, she carved a truth that history can no longer ignore, that love, no matter how forbidden, is the most revolutionary act of all. Beneath the gray skies of the Scottish Highlands, where wind and memory intertwine, Anna Gordon's story endures, not as a relic of scandal, but as a testament to defiance. She lived in a time when a woman's voice was meant to whisper, when love between women was unspeakable, and when compassion in power was considered weakness. Yet she stood against it all. As land was stolen, voices silenced, and lives uprooted, she used her title not as a shield of privilege, but as a weapon of justice. Her reforms changed the fate of countless Highland families. Her advocacy for tenant rights planted the seeds of modern land reform in Scotland, a quiet revolution born from empathy, courage, and rebellion. But her truest revolution was of the heart. In her private letters, in her fearless choices, she redefined what it meant to be a woman of power in a man's world. Anna's love for Eleanor was more than romance. It was a radical declaration of autonomy in an empire that sought to own even affection. Today, her story resonates across time. Every activist who fights for equality, every person who loves without apology, carries something of Anna's flame. Her life reminds us that the path toward justice is rarely gentle, that visibility often demands sacrifice, and that progress blooms from those who dare to exist authentically, even when history looks away. In an age still grappling with inclusion and truth, Anna Gordon's courage invites us to listen again to the unspoken, the erased, the hidden voices that shaped our world. They whisper from the margins of the past, from old letters and forgotten graves, urging us to remember that love and defiance are not opposites, but reflections of the same light. And if you stand upon the Highland cliffs at dusk, you may still feel her presence in the wind, the countess who dared, the woman who loved, and the echo that refuses to fade. If stories like Anna's stir something within you, help us bring more hidden truths into the light. Like, share, and subscribe to Crown Secrets, where forgotten LGBTQ+ voices from royal courts and political halls rise again. Every click, every comment helps history whisper a little louder until silence is no longer possible.